Less than a week after Hurricane Lala tore through Hawaii's Big Island, killing multiple people and burying homes under 10 feet of mud, a second tropical system is closing in on the exact same stretch of coastline. And here's the part that should genuinely alarm you. On paper, this new storm looks like the weaker one. Tropical Storm Moke is carrying maximum sustained winds of only around 45 to 50 miles per hour, barely more than half the peak strength Hurricane Lala reached before it devastated the island. If you only glanced at the category label, you'd assume this is the lesser threat, a storm that barely deserves a headline compared to what just happened days earlier. You'd be wrong, and the reason you'd be wrong is exactly what this video is about. Tropical Storm Moke is forecast to drop up to 15 inches of rain on parts of the Big Island, rainfall totals that rival, and in some spots could exceed, what a full hurricane might produce, landing directly on top of ground that is already completely saturated, communities that are still actively digging out from the last disaster, and terrain that Lala has already stripped of the vegetation and stability that would normally hold it together. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what Moke is doing right now, why a storm this comparatively weak is capable of producing a threat this serious, and why the label tropical storm, instead of hurricane, might be the most dangerously misleading detail in this entire story. Tropical Storm Moke formed in the Central Pacific on Friday, August 21st, 2026, initially tracked by forecasters as Tropical Depression 2C before strengthening into a named tropical storm. As of the most recent advisory from the National Hurricane Center, Moke was centered roughly 360 to 470 miles southeast of Hilo, moving west-northwest at a steady clip of around 12 to 15 miles per hour, carrying maximum sustained winds near 45 to 50 miles per hour, and a minimum central pressure around 994 millibars. Forecasters have said the storm is likely at or very near its peak intensity right now, with increasing wind shear and drier air expected to begin weakening the system by Sunday, continuing into early next week, potentially reducing Moke to a post-tropical cyclone or open trough of low pressure by mid-week. The forecast track sends the center of Moke passing a couple hundred miles south of the Big Island on Sunday, then continuing well south of the remaining Hawaiian Islands into early next week. That's actually a meaningfully different path than Hurricane Lala took just days earlier. Moke is forecast to stay farther offshore, and its strongest winds are expected to remain out over open water rather than directly striking land. Because the storm is compact and the short-term track forecast carries high confidence, the National Hurricane Center hasn't issued the kind of tropical storm watches or warnings for the islands themselves that would typically accompany a storm passing this close. On the surface, all of that sounds like genuinely good news. A weaker storm, staying farther offshore with its most dangerous winds never making direct landfall, that's precisely the framing that makes what comes next so important to understand. It's also worth understanding what peak intensity actually means for a storm like this. Moke has been fighting against a genuinely hostile atmospheric environment for essentially its entire life cycle so far. Persistent wind shear tearing at the storm's structure and exposing much of its southern half, while dry air gets pulled into the circulation and works against further strengthening. Satellite imagery has shown convection, the towering thunderstorm activity that powers a tropical cyclone, largely confined to pulses in the storm's northern half, rather than the more organized, symmetric structure you'd see in a storm with room to intensify further. In practical terms, that means Moke was never on a trajectory to become anything close to a major hurricane. But it also means the storm has spent much of its short existence disorganized in exactly the way that makes rainfall forecasting trickier, and, in some cases, allows heavy rain bands to persist and train over the same stretch of terrain even as the storm's overall wind field weakens. Despite Moke's winds staying largely offshore, the National Hurricane Center and local Hawaii forecasters are projecting rainfall totals of 5 to 10 inches across the Big Island, with isolated windward and southeast slopes potentially seeing as much as 15 inches. Maui is forecast to pick up 4 to 6 inches. The remaining islands are expected to see generally lighter totals, in the range of 1 to 4 inches, though some isolated pockets could see more depending on exactly how the moisture bands track. Rain is expected to ramp up on the Big Island and Maui through Sunday afternoon and evening, spreading to the rest of the state by Sunday night into Monday, with the heaviest, most dangerous bands continuing into Tuesday before the system finally weakens and moves off to the west. Alongside the rain, forecasters are warning of gusty winds across the islands, particularly in and downslope of higher terrain, with east-northeast winds of 25 to 35 miles per hour and gusts up to 55 miles per hour possible in areas covered by wind advisories. On top of the rain and wind, Moke is also expected to generate elevated surf and dangerous rip currents along east and south-facing shores, conditions forecasters have specifically flagged as potentially life-threatening for anyone in the water. Emergency management officials in Hawaii County aren't waiting to see how this plays out. Shelters have already been opened ahead of the storm's arrival, with officials specifically urging residents in flood-prone or otherwise unsafe areas to relocate before conditions deteriorate. That's a notably faster, more proactive posture than the response to Lala just over a week earlier, a sign that local officials are treating this second storm with real seriousness, even though its wind speeds alone would suggest a far more modest threat. There's a specific offshore hazard worth calling out too, separate from the flooding and landslide risk on land. The National Hurricane Center has posted a tropical storm warning for Hawaiian offshore waters, extending from 40 to 240 nautical miles out from the islands, covering a stretch of ocean that includes part of the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument, one of the largest protected marine areas on Earth. Tropical storm force winds extend outward as far as 90 to 115 miles from Oaks Center, meaning the storm's actual wind field, even while staying offshore, still reaches out and touches a genuinely enormous area of ocean. Mariners, fishing vessels, and anyone operating in those waters face a real active hazard, even though the islands themselves are expected to avoid the storm's strongest winds entirely. Here's the mechanism at the heart of this entire story, and it's the exact same physical principle that made Hurricane Lala so devastating just days earlier, even though that storm never technically made landfall either. A storm's category or classification, tropical storm, Category 1 hurricane, Category 3 hurricane, is based almost entirely on one single measurement: sustained wind speed. That number tells you plenty about structural wind damage, about whether roofs are likely to come off buildings, about whether trees are likely to snap. It tells you almost nothing. About rainfall. And when it comes to a tropical system approaching a place like Hawaii, rainfall is very often the hazard that actually kills people and destroys homes, not wind. Hawaii's islands are dominated by steep volcanic terrain, and that terrain interacts with a tropical system's moisture in a way that has almost nothing to do with how strong the storm's winds happen to be. As moist air gets forced to rise rapidly up the side of a steep volcanic slope, it cools, and cooler air simply can't hold as much water vapor as warmer air. That moisture gets wrung directly out of the atmosphere as rain, often at rates dramatically higher than what the same storm would produce passing over flat, open ocean. This effect, called orographic lift, doesn't care whether the storm generating the moisture has 50-mile-per-hour winds or 150-mile-per-hour winds. What matters is how much moisture the storm is carrying and how directly that moisture gets funneled into the island's mountainous terrain. A slow-moving, moisture-rich tropical storm passing at exactly the wrong angle relative to those slopes can produce rainfall totals that rival or exceed a much more powerful hurricane that happens to be moving faster or carrying less overall moisture. That's precisely the trap sitting inside Moak's forecast right now. Because its peak winds are staying offshore, its official classification stays modest. But the rainfall numbers being forecast for the Big Island specifically, 5 to 10 inches, with isolated totals up to 15, sit in the same range that a genuinely dangerous, landfalling hurricane might produce elsewhere in the world. The wind category is telling you one thing. The actual hazard on the ground is telling you something considerably more serious. This isn't a new or unique feature of Hawaii's geography either. It's a pattern that shows up again and again wherever tropical moisture meets steep terrain. The same basics mechanism that's driving concern about Moak's rainfall forecast played out with catastrophic consequences during Hurricane Lala just over a week ago, when the storm's mountainous interior collected more than 3.5 feet of rain despite the hurricane itself topping out at a comparatively modest Category 1 on the wind scale. It's the same mechanism behind flash flood disasters in mountainous regions worldwide, from the Appalachians to the Himalayas. Elevation change forces air upward. Upward motion wrings out moisture, and the resulting rainfall totals often have far more to do with the shape of the land than with how fast the wind happens to be blowing at the storm's center hundreds of miles away. Now layer onto that the single most important detail in this entire story, where all of that rain is about to fall. Just over a week ago, Hurricane Lala dumped more than 3.5 feet of rain onto the mountainous interior of the Big Island, a genuinely staggering total that triggered catastrophic landslides and flash flooding across the island's southern districts. In the town of Naalihu specifically, mud, water, rock, and debris tore through large sections of the community, in some cases burying homes under mud as much as 10 feet deep. That flooding and those landslides didn't just damage the landscape temporarily, they fundamentally altered how the ground in these areas responds to new rainfall. This is the exact same physical principle that turned an ordinary summer storm into a historic flood disaster in Indiana just weeks. Earlier this same August, when soil is already completely saturated, it loses almost all of its capacity to absorb any additional rain. Instead of soaking into the ground the way it normally would, new rainfall runs off almost immediately, funneling directly into streams, gullies, and drainage channels that are often still damaged or clogged with debris from the previous storm. On the Big Island's steep volcanic slopes, that runoff doesn't just cause flooding. It reactivates the exact kind of landslide and mudslide risk that just devastated Naalehu, because the soil holding those slopes together has already lost much of the structural integrity that vegetation and stable ground normally provide. Forecasters covering Moke have been explicit about this connection. Official warnings specifically flag the risk of life-threatening flooding and mudslides for the windward and southeast Big Island, and they call out, by name, the exact areas recently affected by Lala as being at heightened risk from this second round of rain. That's not standard boilerplate storm language. That's meteorologists directly telling the public that the danger from Moke isn't despite what Lala already did to this landscape. It's because of it. There's a longer-term dimension to this compounding risk that's worth understanding too, because it doesn't resolve itself the moment Moke moves past the islands. Landslide-scarred terrain doesn't return to its pre-storm stability in a matter of days or even weeks. The vegetation root systems that normally help hold hillside soil in place take months or years to regrow, and slopes that have already failed once, the way sections of Naalehu did under Lala, often remain measurably more prone to failure during subsequent storms for a considerable stretch of time afterward. That means the elevated risk Moke is bringing to these specific communities isn't a one-time coincidence of unfortunate timing. It's the leading edge of what could be a genuinely extended period of heightened vulnerability, where even ordinary heavy rain events, not just tropical systems, carry a meaningfully higher landslide risk than they would have before Lala ever arrived. It's worth pausing here on the human toll from Hurricane Lala, because Moke isn't arriving in a community that's already recovered and moved on. It's arriving in a community that is still actively grieving and still actively searching for answers. Just last week, a 93-year-old woman on the Big Island died from what the Hawaii Police Department described as storm-related injuries tied to Lala. Police are also separately investigating the death of an unidentified man in his 60s, whose passing they believe may also be connected to the storm. Large parts of Naalehu remain smothered in mud, in some places up to 10 feet deep, homes destroyed or rendered unsafe, families displaced with recovery work still very much underway. Emergency crews, utility workers, and residents themselves have spent the past week in active recovery mode, clearing debris, restoring power to tens of thousands of homes still without electricity, and beginning the long process of assessing exactly how much of the island's infrastructure needs to be rebuilt. Now, into that exact environment, a second tropical system is arriving, with the potential to dump nearly as much rain in some locations as the storm that just caused all of that damage in the first place. That's the layered reality driving officials' unusually proactive response this time around, opening shelters ahead of the storm's arrival, rather than waiting to react once conditions worsen, and treating a mere tropical storm with a level of urgency that its wind speed alone wouldn't necessarily justify. There's also a specific contingency worth mentioning that illustrates just how many overlapping hazards Hawaii County is having to plan around simultaneously. Officials have prepared alternate access plans for Highway 11 near Hawaii Volcanoes National Park in case Kilauea, the island's active volcano, happens to erupt during the storm, restricting the highway to area residents only and limiting access to nearby communities to local and disaster response traffic if that scenario unfolds. It's a reminder that a place like the Big Island doesn't get to plan for hazards one at a time. Volcanic activity, storm flooding, and landslide risk all sit stacked on top of each other, all requiring contingency plans that account for more than one disaster potentially unfolding at once. Step back from Moke specifically. And there's a broader lesson embedded in this story that applies well beyond this one storm, and it's one worth carrying into how you read every tropical system forecast from here forward. The public conversation around tropical cyclones almost always centers on category and wind speed, because those numbers are simple, dramatic, and easy to compare. Category 1 sounds mild. Category 5 sounds catastrophic. But repeatedly, across disaster after disaster, it's turned out that wind category tells you surprisingly little about the actual danger a specific storm poses to a specific place. Hurricane Lala itself never technically made landfall on the Big Island, and it was rated only a Category 1 storm at its peak, the lowest rung on the hurricane scale, and it still triggered landslides that swept homes off their foundations, knocked out power to well over 100,000 people, and directly contributed to at least one death, with a second under investigation. The category rating wasn't wrong, it just wasn't measuring the hazard that actually mattered most in that specific location. Moke is now repeating that exact same lesson, just from the opposite direction, where Lala was a hurricane whose true danger came from rainfall rather than wind. Moke isn't even being classified as a hurricane at all, and its true danger is, once again, coming almost entirely from rainfall. This time, compounded by the fact that it's falling directly on top of ground that Lala has already pushed past its breaking point. If you're only tracking these storms by their official category label, you would reasonably expect Moke to be a minor, forgettable footnote next to the hurricane that struck the same island a week earlier, the forecast rainfall totals, the specific warnings about landslides in areas Lala already devastated, and the fact that local officials are opening shelters proactively all say otherwise. This pattern extends well beyond Hawaii, too, and it's worth keeping in mind any time a storm is approaching anywhere with mountainous or hilly terrain. Some of the deadliest tropical cyclones in recent memory, across multiple countries and multiple oceans, have been storms that weakened to a tropical storm or even a depression before their rainfall did the real damage, the wind speed dropping steadily even as the storm continued dumping enormous volumes of moisture onto whatever terrain happened to be sitting underneath it. Meteorologists who study tropical cyclone impacts have increasingly pushed back against wind speed only messaging for exactly this reason, arguing that rainfall potential, storm forward speed, and the specific terrain a storm is approaching often matter more to actual outcomes than the category number that ends up in most headlines. Moke, arriving in Hawaii barely a week after Lala, is likely to become one more entry in that same growing list. As of the most recent advisory, Tropical Storm Moke remains on track to pass south of the Big Island later today, with the heaviest rain bands already beginning to move across windward and southeast portions of the island. Maximum sustained winds remain near 45 to 50 miles per hour, and forecasters continue to expect the storm to weaken gradually over the coming days as it encounters increasing wind shear and drier air, likely degrading into a post-tropical cyclone or open trough sometime around midweek. Rainfall is expected to spread progressively westward across the state through Monday, reaching Maui by Sunday afternoon and Oahu and Kauai by late Sunday night into Monday. A flood watch remains in effect for the Big Island through at least Monday night, and a wind advisory covering parts of the Big Island and Maui County remains active into Sunday evening. Hawaii County has already opened shelters for residents in flood-prone or otherwise vulnerable areas, and officials continue urging anyone in those zones to relocate before conditions worsen further rather than waiting until the heaviest rain bands actually arrive. Beyond the immediate rainfall threat, Moke is also expected to generate elevated surf and dangerous rip currents along east and south-facing shores over the next several days, a hazard officials are treating as potentially life-threatening independent of the flooding risk on land. Drier, more typical trade wind weather isn't expected to return to the islands until sometime around Tuesday, once Moke has moved sufficiently far to the west and weakened enough to stop feeding tropical moisture into the region. Recovery efforts from Hurricane Lala are continuing in parallel with preparations for Moke, rather than pausing to wait for the new storm to pass. Utility crews remain focused on restoring power to the portions of the grid still affected by Lala's damage. Road crews continue clearing debris from areas like Naalehu, and investigators continue working to confirm whether the death of the man in his 60s found after Lala should be formally attributed to the storm. Local officials have acknowledged publicly that responding to a second tropical threat while recovery work from the first is still actively underway stretches emergency resources in ways that a single isolated storm would not. First, responders, shelter staff, and public works crews are effectively being asked to manage two overlapping disaster timelines at once, rather than the more typical sequence of impact, response, and then recovery playing out one storm at a time. What makes the story worth paying close attention to isn't really about Tropical Storm Moke in isolation. It's about what happens when a genuinely dangerous storm arrives, wearing a label that makes it sound far less threatening than it actually is. Wind category is an easy number to headline, and an easy number to compare, storm to storm. But it was never designed to capture the specific compounding danger of heavy rain falling on ground that's already lost its ability to absorb any more water. Hawaii is currently living through a real-world demonstration of exactly how that gap between official classification and actual danger can play out twice in the same week on the same island against the same vulnerable communities. Lala arrived as a hurricane and did its worst damage through rain and landslides rather than wind. Moke is arriving as a tropical storm and appears set to do largely the same thing in largely the same places against ground that has even less capacity to withstand it than it did the first time around. If there's a single lesson worth taking away from this story, it's this. The next time a storm gets labeled as just a tropical storm rather than a hurricane, that label is not a reliable measure of how much danger it's actually carrying, especially for anyone living on terrain that's already been pushed to its limit by whatever storm came before it. For anyone in Hawaii watching this story unfold in real time, the practical takeaway is straightforward. Even if the meteorology behind it is complicated, don't wait for an upgrade to hurricane status before taking a storm seriously. And don't assume that a storm passing hundreds of miles offshore means the danger is passing you by as well. Rainfall totals, not wind speed, are what turned Lala into a fatal disaster, and rainfall totals, not wind speed, are exactly what officials are warning about again this week. If you live anywhere near the areas already, Affected by Lala's flooding and landslides, or in any other low-lying or steep terrain across the islands, the guidance from Hawaii County officials remains the same as it was a week ago. Don't wait until the heaviest rain arrives to move somewhere safer. We'll keep following Moke's track and rainfall totals as the system moves through the islands over the coming days, along with the ongoing recovery effort from Hurricane Lala that this second storm is now landing directly on top of. If you want to stay updated the moment conditions change, make sure you're subscribed. Because in a place like Hawaii, the storm that looks smaller on paper isn't always the one that ends up mattering less.